Any more nightmares? Everything is fine when you sleep?
I'm going to ask you a question. Remember.
In December 1964, a seriously disturbed, dysfunctional couple consulted Dr. Benjamin Simon in Boston.
It's a bit of a problem.
Are you having visions?
Barney and Betty Hill's hypnosis therapy shook the field of ufology.
Visions, just flashes. No.
I'm gonna shoot that thing! I'm gonna get my gun! I'm gonna shoot it down! I'm gonna shoot that thing, man! I'm gonna shoot that thing!
Barney, listen to me. Listen to me, Barney. And try to stay calm. Nothing's gonna hurt you.
It was now no longer possible to discuss UFOs without including alien abductions, a controversial issue. According to surveys, nearly 4 million Americans fit the profile of an abductee. A growing number of victims think they have an implant somewhere in their body, tracking their moves, their state, their metabolism, and even their thoughts. They feel like lab rats being studied by another world. According to British ufologist John Spencer, Barney and Betty Hill's story was the wake-up call for the phenomenon of alien abductions.
For many years, one of the aspects of UFOs I've studied in some depth is the abduction phenomenon, the idea that people are manipulated to some degree by UFO entities, that they are taken aboard the flying saucers, that they are examined usually in some medical way, that they are sometimes given a mission, or they are perhaps implanted with devices and so on, and that they are constantly, throughout their lives, and even their children's lives and their children's lives, are affected by UFO intervention, which seems to be tracking the bloodline, which I think Bud Hopkins has described in many cases. And I'm very open to the possibility, and certainly I'm totally convinced that these people are genuinely reporting a real phenomenon, a paranormal phenomenon. I'm quite sure of that. I've spoken to many of them, and perhaps most significant for me, I've found something in the order of about 20 or 30 people I've spoken to who have totally changed their lives as a result of their abduction phenomenon. They have suddenly become artistic, for example. They have suddenly become musicians, or they've gone into art from being bank clerks and accountants. They've suddenly become camera people or whatever else, where they've gone into that side of life. And it has resulted, undoubtedly, from the abduction phenomenon. The question is whether or not it's an internal or an external thing.
Reports of alien abductions have been on the rise ever since the first case was reported in 1961. People believe they were abducted while sleeping by aliens capable of passing through walls and moving instantly from one spot to another. Even though thousands of cases have been investigated, UFO experts use Barney and Betty's experience to support the existence of abductions. Their story began one night on a remote highway in the White Mountains, when the couple wandered off Route 3 and found themselves in the mountains.
September 19th, 1961. My husband Barney and I are in Montreal, and we heard a weather report that a hurricane was coming up the coast and probably would hit our hometown of Portsmouth. So we decided to return to Portsmouth, get there before the hurricane did.
Betty and Barney were on their way home from Montreal. Both had been married before and both had children, but Betty's were adopted since she was sterile.
And this was after the summer tourists, and we knew that the mountains were going to be deserted, facilities would be closed. So we went through customs and we stopped in Colebrook and got gas for the car and had a lunch. So we knew it was about 10 o'clock when we left Colebrook.
Betty was a social worker, and Barney was a postal worker and a member of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. They were both around 40 years old, and neither had any history of psychological problems.
And we're driving down through the mountains when I suddenly saw a new star in the sky. And as I watched it, it became bigger and brighter. And my first thought was, is it a comet going to hit the Earth? So we stopped the car to get out to get a good look at this. And as we did, it passed in front, it changed direction and passed over the face of the moon. And we could see that it had multicolored flashing lights around it. And then it turned and started coming in towards us. So we started driving south. We did this for about 30 miles. And we had no idea what this craft was. We were trying to identify it. And I put the window down and I waved to him and said, hi. And about a half mile south, they came out over the highway, midair, and stopped. Now, my husband had been in World War II, so he's going to get out and identify this craft. And he takes the binoculars and he walks towards it. And as he looks up, he sees a group of men standing in a window looking down at him. And at that moment, a fin-like structure parted on each side of the craft and had a red light on the end of the fin, and the craft started to come down. Barney had the feeling they were trying to capture him.
They're gonna catch us away. Let's get out of here, man. Let's get out of here. They're gonna catch us. Let's leave. Let's go.
Disoriented and distraught, the Hills realized where they were when they saw a sign 17 miles from the town of Concord. They had taken 2 hours longer than expected to drive through the White Mountains. The next day, they told the Army what had happened to them. The Army was quite interested, since they had detected an unidentified radar echo over the White Mountains during the same time frame. But there were holes in the Hills story.
In the beginning, we remembered seeing the men in the road, but we couldn't get beyond that. And so we would go back there about once a month, thinking if we could find the spot where we saw the men in the road, we could remember what happened. And we were beginning to get little memories back, but nothing too shocking. And then Barney's health failed, and he wasn't responding to medication, so his doctor sent him to a psychiatrist. And one day, Barney mentioned how we were going north through the mountains and looking for the spot, and we would find all kinds of people who had all kinds of UFO sightings, but nobody knew where the spot was. So he referred us to Dr. Benjamin Simon in Boston, and we started medical hypnosis.
A week later, Betty began to have nightmares in which she was abducted by aliens. She wrote down her dreams and told Barney about them. Ever since the night of the abduction, the couple had been suffering from health problems. Finally, 2 years after the abduction, the Hills agreed to be placed under hypnosis by Dr. Benjamin Simon. The following are excerpts from those sessions.
I want to wake up.
You're not going to wake up. You're in a deep sleep. You're comfortable, relaxed. This is not going to trouble you.
This creature, this leader is telling me something.
How? How's he getting it to you?
I can see it in his face.
Do you see his
Telling
lips
me?
move? Yes.
No, his lips aren't moving. He's looking at me.
What did he tell you?
Stay there and keep looking. Just stay there, he's saying to me. It's
All right.
pounding in my head. Just
All right.
pull the binoculars away. God, give me strength.
All right.
Pull him down. Run! Pull his binoculars down and run! God!
All right. Calm down. Calm down.
Betty and Barney's testimony is very important, especially since it was the first of its kind. So we know that it was not tainted by media sensationalism.
Les médias racontant des histoires de ce genre, en fait.
And they were treated by a well-known Boston psychiatrist who questioned them separately under hypnosis for a period of 6 months.
Qui les a interrogés séparément sous hypnose pendant 6 mois. Et ils ont raconté
They
la
both
même
told
histoire.
the same story. Betty Hill elaborated more than Barney, but he had been traumatized by what had happened to him.
Ils revenaient de vacances du Canada.
They were on their way back home after holidays in Canada. They were headed towards the Boston area, and they saw a UFO following them.
Qui les suivaient, ils se sont arrêtés. Ils
They pulled over and saw that the UFO was hovering over the highway.
au-dessus de la route. Et puis, ils
They
ont
don't
fait un
remember
peu
what
le
happened
regard
after
de ce qui se
that.
passait, et ils se sont retrouvés
Next thing you know, they were back on the highway 2 hours later, feeling groggy,
sur la route.
and they continued on their way home.
C'est par la suite, donc.
Sometime later, Barney was feeling ill, and they went to see Dr. Benjamin Simon.
Qu'ils ont donc été soignés sous hypnose par le docteur Benjamin Simon. Il s'appelle.
Under hypnosis, they each separately gave a very detailed account of having been abducted and taken aboard a UFO.
Chacun séparément. Le docteur Simon il y a eu
A book was written in collaboration with Dr. Simon, who had not previously believed in the existence of UFOs.
Pas possible de croire ça. Mais il reconnaît
He admitted that Betty and Barney were convinced that their story was real, and their testimony was both forceful and disturbing.
Très solide et très troublant.
Go on.
And he said, just a simple test of me. And I asked him what. And he said he just wants to put it in my navel. It's just a simple test.
I didn't hear that.
To Betsy Hyde.
Did they make any sexual advances to you?
We saw what we thought was the moon setting. And then we saw a group of men in the road blocking our way. He stopped the car. The motor died. They came up, took us out of the car along a path in the woods. All they wanted to do was some simple tests to find out how we were like or dislike, or how we are different or like each other. And as soon as the testing would be over with, we could go back to the car. So we called him the leader. The one who did the testing, we called the examiner. And then there were 9 others that stayed out in the corridor, so we called them the crew members. Now, we were taken into separate rooms, and the first part of our exams were the same. They checked our eyes, ears, nose, throat, mouth, our feet. And then with me, they did 2 testings. One was in my nervous system, and the second one was they tried to put a needle in my navel, which he said was a pregnancy test. And with Barney, the first part was the same as mine. But with him, they were basically interested in his bone structure. And then I said, I know you're not from this planet. Where are you from? And he showed me the star map. And then they came leading Barney out. And then I went to the car, and we watched the craft leave, and it lifted out of that and was gone.
In 1966, American journalist John Fuller published the Hill story under the title The Interrupted Journey. It was a huge success. The Hill story contains several details which leave little doubt as to its authenticity. How could Betty Hill have been able to describe a pregnancy test consisting of inserting a long needle into her navel when this procedure was not to be used by doctors for another 10 years? While under hypnosis, Betty drew a star map that she saw while on board the UFO. It appeared to match the double star Zeta Reticuli, which was discovered years after Betty drew her star map. What is most interesting is that the story came out under hypnosis, after both had suffered from amnesia and both basically told the same story.
When the abduction phenomenon came to light in the Betty and Barney Hill case, there were no theories about it because it had never been reported in any objective way before. And we must always remember it was a skeptical scientist, a psychiatrist, who did the hypnosis, who was stunned by what he was hearing and had to assume that this was a folie à deux of some sort that nobody was familiar with all of the effects of what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. So it was certainly real. This is a myth that nobody wanted.
You know, in 1979, Alvin Lawson, who was a professor of English at California State University at Long Beach, conducted a little bit of an experiment. He took 8 students who had not had UFO sightings, which was his filter, and had a hypnotist hypnotize them to see whether they could come out with abduction stories. And he claimed essentially that they were all essentially the same, and therefore as all the other abduction stories, and therefore all of it came from people's minds. But actually, when you read the study, what you find is that one story was actually had certain similarities. There were small people, and she was on a table, and that sort of stuff. The other stories were all totally different from each other, completely different from anything that we ever learned in the abduction phenomenon. All the UFO abductors that they described were completely different from each other and totally different than anything that we have learned in the abduction phenomenon. And they hadn't the slightest idea what to say.
Alvin Lawson's study was not very conclusive. The abduction stories imagined by the study group under hypnosis varied from one person to the next. On the other hand, people who claim to have been genuinely abducted have very similar stories, and the details are very coherent. Dr. Jean-Jacques Laurence, a psychologist at Concordia University, has taken an interest in these abduction stories.
What we found interesting was that most of these stories came out after a hypnosis treatment. Since our lab specializes in hypnosis and memory work, we knew right away that hypnosis was a dangerous instrument in terms of the reliability of a person's memory. So we decided to check whether hypnosis could be used to create false memories, to manipulate existing memories, and add to them. We studied several subjects, and we found that using an experience such as a nightmare or sleep paralysis, people could take an unusual incident and turn it into an alien abduction.
Each year, thousands of people report being abducted while they're sleeping. As was the case with the Hills, hypnosis seems to be the tool that helps to reveal the details of the abduction.
And I think actually what was important there is to recognize certain things that happened, which is that hypnosis was used to bring out this story, and hypnosis has been proven time and time again by people like psychologist Martin Orm to be totally unreliable. That in fact people report what they believe, which is not the same as what actually happened. They're reporting their genuine beliefs. That in the Hill case there was a certain amount of filtering between the two of them. That in fact the key mystery, which was 2 hours lost, was not discovered by the Hills. It was discovered in fact by Walter Webb, who was the investigator, who said to them, "You seem to have lost time." And I believe I'm quoting reasonably accurately Barney Hill saying, "My God, for the first time I realized that we had lost 2 hours." This was several weeks after the experience. So a lot of these key motifs of abductions actually didn't so much come from the witnesses as the investigators. And I do believe that one of the things we learnt from the Hill case onwards and so on is that investigators can take a case, take the key elements and take it to another case, and using particularly hypnosis, not deliberately and not consciously, but I think we contaminate our own data by taking these belief systems around. What I'm saying is that the evidence, the story that comes out, can be influenced by the people investigating, and to do a good investigation is actually far trickier than we think.
A few years ago, I decided to spend all of my time studying abductions. I decided to do this because when I traveled the world as a journalist, I heard similar stories from people throughout the world. I heard stories of abductions when I spent 6 months in Siberia, and also when I stayed 6 months in Tibet. Wherever I went, I would hear tales of abductions from people who had no clue that there were other people in the world who had experienced the same thing. These stories bothered me, and then when I saw what was happening in the States, I thought to myself, those Americans are crazy.
Hoaxers in this field are extremely, extremely rare. But in the abduction area, you have to come up to various people, like myself and others, and look us in the eye and say, this happened to me. And in front of your wife and children, this happened to me, and go into something which involves acting, lying, and of course, adverse publicity in the long term. So it's not an issue. It's a non-starter as a theory.
There are witnesses to these events. They're family members, sometimes with friends and so forth, who can verify their experiences. When they are abducted, they are physically missing from their normal environment. Police have been called, search parties have been sent out, parents have been frantic looking for their children and all that. They come back with unusual scars on their bodies, scrapes. There's a certain physical evidence. They come back with their clothes not on right, or their pajamas or their pants on backwards. They come back if it's at night, sometimes their clothes are off and folded neatly on a couch or by their bed, or they come back wearing somebody else's clothes, which can be fairly startling, let's just say. And there's more, and there's other evidence that's presented. There's a strong physical aspect to this. But the key thing is that people see other people being abducted and may or may not be abducted themselves. And once that fact is established, it pushes it out of the psychological realm. And that is the fact that all psychologists stumble on.